Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to tonight's presentation. My name is David Blauvelt. I'm the coordinator of education here for the North Andover Historical Society. And before we begin tonight, some quick announcements. Please silence your cell phones for respect to the people around you and our great presenter this evening. If you do need a restroom, the restrooms are out the way you came, off to your right-hand side in the little alcove. Also, in case of an emergency, we have two emergency exits. We have this one that you walked in on, and then we have this one, which takes us directly out to the back parking lot. Tonight's speaker is Jonathan Lane. He has 30 years of experience across the Massachusetts Historical Society, the Antiquarian Society, and many other places. But right now, he is executive director of Massachusetts Rev 250. He has been a great help to us in our Rev 250 programming. And now he is going to deliver some programming directly to you guys. So without further ado, please a round of applause for Mr. Jonathan Lane.
Thank you. So I'm actually going to back it up one slide, I think. Let's see. There we go. So this talk actually comes to you courtesy largely of John Adams, who said, if you want to know the real history of the American Revolution, don't read any of the histories of the American Revolution, mostly because they didn't mention John Adams enough. But in this particular case, he argued for two methods of investigating the Revolution. He argued for using the Committee of Correspondence records. So some of you may remember in November of 1772, the town meeting of Boston sent out a pamphlet in which they advocated for the creation of committees of correspondence, one in every town of Massachusetts, which in 1774-75, you're talking about 225 communities. And then one, at least one in every of the colonies in North America. And as part of that, many of the towns did in fact set up their own committees of correspondence. And the idea was, you know, this is 18th century Facebook, right? They're sharing information and news of what's going on and asking questions of each other. So the Boston Committee of Correspondence records, regrettably, are in New York City. But New York Public Library has done a great job of digitizing them, making them available. And I encourage you to go and look at these records. They're not indexed, they're not searchable, but the images are really well done. And if you're good at reading handwriting, this is a great opportunity, a great way to get involved with the 18th century records. Adams also said you should go to the town meeting records. And really, we don't do enough in promoting the history of town meeting in the history of the American Revolution, because that's where all the good stuff happens. General Gage would argue that's where all the trouble happens. But in this particular case, this is where the sentiments of the people can truly be known. And when I took this job back in 2017, that was the first thing I did. Was I started going through the town meeting records, I started going through the Committee of Correspondence records, and really trying to get a sense of what it was the people were arguing. So I start up here with a couple of sentiments, and I just want to say at the outset, this is my little caveat, this is in no way reflective of modern politics. Any parallels that you see are drawn by you and you alone. But I will say this is one of the important reasons why we encourage people to investigate this history, to inform ourselves as to where we've been, how we got out of it, and where we can go towards the future. So up here, the town of Newton says, resolve that no good man can be silent or inactive in the cause of liberty. I think we can all agree with that, right? You know, we want an active and engaged citizenry. So true back then, true now. And it's important to reflect on the member that even though the franchise was not open to everybody, women were excluded, people of color were excluded, indigenous people were excluded, and legally, people who owned less than 40 pounds of property were excluded. But by this time in Massachusetts history, that is not observed as much as one of the things you'll see is that town meetings are called for town meeting warrants are sent out to people who qualify for voting in the town and other inhabitants. So you read about the town like Shrewsbury, where they've got 155 households, 175 households, but 155 people are showing up to vote at town meetings. So you get a real sense that the franchise has opened up a little bit. I threw this up the last time I did this talk because, of course, famously, for those of you who may be Abigail Adams fans, you'll recognize where she says that most men would be tyrants if they could. And so imagine my surprise when I see this quote from the Abington town meeting of January 1773, "Nature has left the tincture in the blood that most men would be tyrants if they could, and if the greater don't, the less devour. 'Tis not for want of will, but want of power." It wasn't new to Abington either. This is actually a quote from Daniel Defoe. So Daniel Defoe, in the early part of the 18th century, wrote a book on the Kentish Petition, which I'm sure all of you have read. So I don't need to go into it. But for myself, I like to reflect on the fact that the Kentish Petition was a petition, as the title suggests, that was presented to Parliament by men of Kent. And the idea was for greater, essentially, home rule in Kent, particularly in areas of agriculture. And the petition was completely and utterly squashed and denied. And Kent objected. And many of the men who actually presented the petition to Parliament were actually thrown into prison. And it took them a couple of years to get them out, but Defoe was one of the people who led the charge to get the men out of prison. And he wrote this pamphlet and this quote, which of course we see then 70 years later being used by the town of Abington and Abigail Adams. So it gives you a sense of the kind of reading that people in Massachusetts are doing in the run-up to this great debate. So the topic of the talk is, of course, Vox Populi, the voice of the people. How did we get here? How did we get to revolution? Of course, we just celebrated the 250th anniversary of Lexington and Concord, so we're coming at this perhaps a little backward, but going back to essentially 1765, when the trouble begins between the Crown, who, of course, established the Stamp Act, and then repealed the Stamp Act, and then established the Townshend duties, and then repealed most of the Townshend duties. But I like to point out, for people who are living in Massachusetts in the 1770s, they are not just arguing for their rights as British subjects. They are arguing for the rights that they feel they have inherited from their forebears, and they want to pass on to their children and grandchildren. They see themselves as a direct conduit between the British Constitution and their children, grandchildren, and others. So you can see this town of Duxbury, of course, Duxbury, Pilgrim's Story, the Miles Standish, John Alden, all the people from Duxbury, and they're talking about their forebears. And of course, this is the time when they start celebrating the landing of the Pilgrims. This is, the first museum dedicated to the Pilgrim story is only 50 years away by the time the revolution breaks out. So, Duxbury, but it isn't just limited to Plymouth Colony. Other people talk about the rights we inherited from our forebears, and that our ancestors brought over to this new world, and they paid for it with blood, they paid for it with sweat, and they passed them on unsullied to the next generation. People ask me often if I've learned anything during this whole 250th, and you can be assured I have. But the thing that astonishes me the most is the depth of knowledge to which people in Massachusetts, not just along the coast, not just in the big towns, but all the way into the Berkshires and other places, how deeply they understood their rights as guaranteed by the Magna Carta, as guaranteed by the 1689 Bill of Rights under William and Mary, as guaranteed by the 1691 Charter. They know these rights, they know these documents, they know what is guaranteed. And I will also point out that just before the 1689 Bill of Rights and the 1691 Charter, Massachusetts had already been through a period of revolution. Sir George Andros had come over to establish the Dominion of New England. As part of that, he shut up the Port of Boston. He suspended town meetings. Stop me if any of this seems familiar. They had already been through this really less than 100 years before what we know as the American Revolution. So the people of Boston are keenly aware that in, if not their own time, then in their grandparents' time, they've seen all this before, and arbitrary power being foisted upon them. So Adams' advice, of course, comes from this letter that he wrote to Jedediah Morse. I love the Adams family because they were obviously very wordy, very prolific. They wrote everything down. And this isn't the only time he recommends this. I'm not going to have you read it all. But essentially, he's talking about the committees of correspondence and town meeting records, and that's really where you get a sense of the voice of the people. So when Sam Adams established these committees of correspondence, and it was Sam Adams' idea, and Virginia likes to say, we established the first committee of correspondence, which is true as long as you add the caveat outside Massachusetts. But it was important for the leaders of the revolutionary movement not just to hear the sentiments of the people, but to try and get the town meetings to pass their resolves or to pass their sentiments nem con, which is a shortened Latin phrase, nemine contradicente, which means without dissent. And by and large, they were pretty capable of doing that. I do love this quote from Attleboro. Attleboro is terrific because obviously their town clerk was a church deacon. And so you read these town meeting records and all their resolves are filled with these great Old Testament biblical allusions, Daniel walking into a lion's den and Cain slaying Abel. And in this particular case, a wise king once said that oppression maketh a wise man mad. We hope not to turn maniacs, which is just perfect. So I'm just going to put these all up here. So when you're talking about how the towns express themselves, how the towns get involved, we're looking at these instructions to representatives. This isn't something we do anymore, and I think we should get back to it. And it's where town meeting essentially puts a committee together. They write a letter to their state representative, and they tell him what they want him to do. And I love that concept, and I'd love to see a state representative get a letter from a town and how they would handle it in this day and age. But they write to their state representatives all the time. And as a matter of fact, a number of the things we're going to talk about tonight come from these instructions to the representatives. Correspondence to the Boston town meeting, of course, so they're directly corresponding between town meetings. That's not supposed to happen in the same way that Boston should not be communicating with the rest of the colonies. That communicating with the rest of the colonies is supposed to go through the governor, but they don't trust the governor. They don't trust Bernard, they don't trust Hutchinson, and they certainly don't trust Gage. And so they are subverting the authority of the governor's office by communicating directly with other legislatures. Correspondence to the Boston Committee of Correspondence, which we've talked about, and they enacted resolves, particularly beginning about 1770. Well, the first ones are 1766, which we'll get into, but they also do it in 1773, 1774, after the Tea Party. They're enacting a lot of resolves, and they enacted covenants. And where you see the covenants most commonly is actually in the establishment of minute companies. So when they establish minute companies, the men who participate frequently write up a little covenant so that they can show that they understand the rights or the responsibilities that they have as essentially town employees, training 2, 3, 4 times a week, depending upon what the town requires of them for pay. This is actually the town of Marlborough, and their representative, Peter Bent. And this, again, for certain towns, you really get a sense of who is leading the town. You know, they refer, Gage and some of his minions refer to the ministers of the churches around here as the Black Regiment because of their black robes. But you do get a sense that in some towns, members of the church, whether it's the deacon or it's the actual minister, has a strong hand upon town meeting. And so this is one of those which is just, I love it. I love the fact that they're trying to drag these Old Testament stories into 18th century Massachusetts public life to illustrate the tyranny of kings and the tyranny of rulers. This is another kind of covenant that we see a lot of in this period. So beginning again in 1772 with the Townsend Acts, they do this sort of non-importation agreement, and they try and get everybody to participate. And actually Harvard University has a series of these petitions. So it works exactly like you'd see somebody with a petition today. They go out with a broadside piece of paper which says, I solemnly swear not to import, use, or take into my possession any British manufacturers. And so this is where you start seeing weaving ticking up and other home manufacturers of things. Well, actually, so you can see here, this is from Newton's. So they actually list everything you're not supposed to use. So, loaf sugar, cordage, anchors, coaches, chases and carriages of all sorts, horse furniture, men and women's hats, men and women's apparel, ready-made household furniture, gloves, men and women's shoes, sole leather, sheathing and dock nails, gold and silver and thread lace of all sorts, gold and silver and buttons, wrought plate of all sorts, diamond, stone and paste ware, snuff, mustard, clocks and watches, silversmiths and jewelers' ware, broadcloths that cost above 10 shillings a yard, muffs, furs and tippets, and all sorts of millinery ware, starch, women and children's stays, fire engines, chinaware, silking. I mean, the list is ridiculous. It's just, but they are, for so long, these things haven't been made in America. In some cases, they're prohibited by law. English Bibles are not allowed to be printed in America until the Revolution breaks out, when the first Bibles are printed in English. You can get Algonquin Bibles, you can get German Bibles, French Bibles, but not a Bible in English. That's one of those printing monopolies that England kept on those. In some cases, the interesting thing is we don't think much about how people did shopping in the 18th century. So there is still this sort of Anglican tradition of you go to a fair once a quarter or maybe once a half a year and you buy in bulk. So it's, your movable Costco where you go out and buy those things. And then, of course, there are merchants and traders. And if your town is not large enough to host a store or a shop of any kind, or maybe your tavern keeper is doing a little trading on the side, or your printer is doing a little trading on the side. But the other thing we don't talk about are the merchants and traders who travel around. Again, this is one of the ways they're spreading news, and gossip, and expressing their feelings. But in this case, Abington is saying in 1770 that that the agreement of the merchants and traders of this town of the Boston relative non-importation has a naturally and righteous tendency to frustrate the schemes of the enemies of the Constitution. It's interesting because we refer to people, the Whigs, the people who we would call patriots today, they use the word enemy much sooner than the British and Tory side do, which is really, General Gage famously does not refer to the American people as the enemy until after Lexington and Concord. But here, we're talking about people who don't support the Whig cause. If you don't support the non-importation agreement, you are an enemy to your country. And that has it's really harsh experiences for some people who live in towns where there's a good level of loyalists who support the Crown and the Crown authority, and people who do not. Towns like Marshfield are a perfect example of that. One of the areas where the Sons of Liberty ran into trouble is in 1765 with the destruction of Thomas Hutchinson's house in the north end of Boston. They also destroyed Andrew Oliver's warehouse, which was on Long Wharf. And if you ever see Paul Revere's engraving of the soldiers landing in 1768 at Long Wharf, and you look at all the buildings on Long Wharf, it's building, 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 gap, building, 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 building. The gap was Andrew Oliver's warehouse that was completely destroyed and thrown into the harbor by the Sons of Liberty in 1765. But this doesn't sit well with a lot of people out in the countryside. They view anarchy and mobs with great suspicion. And this comes to a head when the state legislature, the General Court, there's a bill that's produced to ask the General Court to recompense Thomas Hutchinson for the destruction of his house. And when I mean destruction, I mean they broke every window, every piece of crockery, every mirror in the place. They stole his books, his papers. They stole every piece of money. They completely drank his wine cellar dry, which probably only added fuel to the fire. And literally left him with just a shell of what had been a very lovely house and garden in the North End. So here you have two opinions. You have Stoughton to their representative. Again, they're instructing their representative. We recommend it to you by no means to vote for recompense to be made by the province as a point of justice. They clearly blame Hutchinson for all of the ills of what is going on. And they don't want colony money, taxpayer money, to go towards rebuilding his house or to compensate him for his losses. Newton, however, little bit different. So they're saying, obviously, the violent outrages were committed on August 26th by a number of persons unknown, which is hilarious. On the estates, both real and personal, of several gentlemen in Boston, and is recommended to the Great and General Court that the losses of the sufferers should be made up. And so you have this real debate going on. Nobody likes the violence, but it's, do you compensate Hutchinson, even though he's the most detested man in Massachusetts, or do you not? And in the end, he did get compensated, which only... again, it just outraged people. So the mobs and restitution are an issue. Let's talk about the militarism. And actually, I just want to say, no, this is, okay, we're good. So in 1765, the people of Massachusetts had just gotten out of their latest in a series of wars with the French to the north and the indigenous people who were allied to the French. Of course, the French have largely been removed from, French authority has been removed from the continent. Still a lot of French Catholics living up in Canada. And the people of very Puritan Massachusetts, not great fans of French Catholicism, or really Catholicism of any stripe. They are people who have just come out of a war. The militia has really always been at the heart and soul of the community since the 1620s, 1630s. Everybody's expected to train. Towards the end of the 17th century, there had been a dip in militia participation. and then it was revived again as the what we call the French and Indian Wars began to creep up in the 18th century. But by the 1770s, they knew that the British Army had been landed in Boston in 1768. There was constantly news coming from Great Britain that they were going to send a fleet to blockade the ports of America. And so these are two town meetings. This is 2 years before any war is going to break out. So Bellingham, which is one of my favorites, they talk about robbers coming to your house, and if a robber comes to your house, essentially, should you not put him down? My favorite part of this is the soldiers that are coming to rob you might come off like those that were defeated a few years ago in General Braddock's fight, be cut to pieces and destroyed. And a couple of amazing things about this. The Braddock fight, of course, happened along the Monongahela out in western Pennsylvania. The people of Massachusetts, they could only have read about this. There was no real first-hand knowledge about what happened to Braddock's men and Braddock's troops. But they, of course, they had, since the Braddock fight, Massachusetts men had served alongside parts of the British Army, so they're getting these stories from the other soldiers. They heard about the devastation that happened to Braddock's army, and now they're using it as a threat to King George and King George's army, that if they come here and if they try and cause trouble, the same thing's going to happen to them. My other favorite one is this from Gorham, Maine, of course, which was part of Massachusetts in the 1770s. We only add that our old captain is still living, who for many years has been our chief officer to rally the inhabitants of this town from the plow, sickle, to defend their wives, their children, and all that was dear. Many of our family are inured to the danger and fatigue of flying to garrison. Timber of our fort is yet to be seen, so obviously the fort is not built up, but the pieces are still around. Watch houses are still in beans. Some of our women have been used to handle the cartridge and load the musket, and the swords which we wet and brightened for our enemies are not yet grown rusty. So they're looking at potential conflict with British authority as an entire community effort. And of course, that's really what happens. The women are not going to battle to fight. There are plenty of women who do go with their husbands to war, either as in the camp, or I was just talking to somebody the other day, when Benedict Arnold goes to Canada in the winter of 1775, there are at least 4 women who make that march through the wilds of Maine and Canada to Quebec. And I find that just astonishing to consider. And here we have the town of Gorham, Massachusetts back then, but now Gorham, Maine, saying essentially they're prepared. The tea crisis is obviously where, again, one of those moments where things really come to a head. And there's so much to say about this, because it's really what gets all of the towns roused up. Not just, I mean, there are plenty of towns who were not fans of the destruction of property. Again, if we go back to 1765, we look at how they reacted to the destruction of Hutchinson's house, Oliver's warehouse. They're not huge fans of the destruction of property, no matter whose property it is. But, they say, so this is Hingham's town meeting on the 31st of January, so this is 2 weeks after the destruction of the tea. And they're essentially saying it's the duty of every American to oppose the attempt to forcibly extract a tea tax from the American people. And Newton says similar sorts of things, and that anybody who's active or aiding, so the tea consignees are who they're really pointing at here. 2 of the consignees are sons of Thomas Hutchinson. There's an Oliver in there, and there's a Winslow from Plymouth County. He was a loyalist. And they're essentially, they are inimical to this country. So again, they're enemies of the people, thereby incur our just resentment, in which light we shall view all merchants, traders, and others who shall henceforth presume to import or sell any India tea. And this is fairly universal across the landscape here. So the town of Lexington says that they view the taking of the tax as an assault upon their property. They believe that it is the right of every individual who has an income of any sort to do with it as they please, unless they give it of their own free will. So, they're talking about that it's the natural right and indispensable duty of every man, and consequently of every society or body of men, to consult their own safety, take measures for the preservation of their own liberty and property, without which life itself cannot be deemed worth living. Now, they're pretty serious about all this. Again, Rochester, Massachusetts, which is a town down on the south coast, they're talking about if the state representative doesn't do as they ask, they will see him as a man of self-interest and shall be looked upon the enemy of his country. And this is just over tea. Trials by juries is another part of their concerns. So this particularly comes out after the burning of the HMS Gaspee down in Narragansett Bay in 1772. And it shows up in a number of the acts that Britain passes. The Quartering Act is an extension of the Quartering Act. They essentially say that if anybody is indicted, essentially by jury, to be involved in an event like the burning of the Gaspee, or essentially assault upon any British officer or official. And we tend to forget that one of the major complaints of people back in the 1770s was not just taxes. It was the expansion of royal authority. So it wasn't enough, initially the tea tax lowered the tax on tea. They were trying to outdo the smugglers. But they sent over a bunch of custom enforcement officers. So they grew the footprint of the British Empire in Boston as a means to crack down on smuggling, which was rampant in New England, for sure. But and there's this great quote, actually, from Charlestown. Let me dig it out here because it is just brilliant. Here it is. This is, have any of you seen the movie The Town or Mystic River? Everything in those movies about Charlestown, totally true. And it goes back a long way. This is what they say. And it adds to our mortification to see the money thus raised from taxes tender the specious pretense of supporting government, applied not only in supporting pensioners and placemen in independency, whose talents are from mercenary views employed by false representations in making the most unhappy differences between the mother country and her colonies, but also in maintaining in idleness and luxury an infamous set of spies, pimps, informers, and with many of whom the sole qualification is a total unfitness for any honest calling. That's pretty harsh. But they were serious about this. They didn't like to see the expansion of paid offices, even in town meeting. They didn't like to grow the number of offices that had, sure, you needed your fence viewer and you needed your hog reeve and all of those offices, but one of the amusing things you see is that towns will offer their minute companies a bonus So if you sign up, if you enlist in the Minute Company, you get paid, let's say, 1 shilling 6 pence for every day you train or half day you train. But if you enlist, just for the sake of enlisting, we're going to give you 6 pounds or 4 pounds. And then 2 months later, you see them rescind that bonus. We're going to rescind that bonus because the colonies promised to make up the difference, which of course the colony never makes up the difference, right? So, but anyway, you have the trial by juries, and this is, again, this is one of those Magna Carta rights. This goes back to, the very earliest days of the British Constitution, and here they're arguing for it in America, talking about the alarming extension of the power of the courts of admiralty. So that's the customs officials. In these courts, one judge presides alone. No juries have any concern here. The law and the fact are both to be decided by the same single judge, whose commission is only during the pleasure, and with whom, as we were told, the most mischievous of all customs has become established, that of taking commissions on all condemnations. So what they mean by that is, let's say John Hancock has a ship of Madeira wine come into port. They seize the ship, as they did once, and all of that cargo and the ship can then be sold at auction. And the money goes to the customs officials in part. So the more arrests you make, the more money you make. And again, for the American colonists, that was just outrageous. My favorite, instructions to represent. And I only say that because I've had to do a lot of work with the legislature over the last couple of years. And I would love towns to start instructing their legislature a little bit more. But here's just some towns. So Rutland to John Murray. John Murray wasn't even a resident of Rutland. And that's one of the weird things about representation in the 18th century and in Massachusetts. The person who's your representative doesn't have to be from your town. You can hire anybody. In the same way that Massachusetts hired an agent to promote their interests at court to a lesser or greater degree. So the town of Rutland to, we expect that you will make our instructions the rule of your conduct in said office. I would love to see that. And particularly from somebody like John Murray. John Murray definitely was a waffling loyalist. And for as much as sought by some, the enlargement of these circuits, the salaries of the judges, paying the judges. Who pays the judges? Whoever pays the judges gets the justice, right? So now the judges are supposed to be paid for by the crown and the crown only. This is another complaint. And so the people of Massachusetts feel they're never going to get justice because the judges owe their position and their salary to the king. Question comes up between the crown and the people. Who are they going to side with? I mean, really. We desire you to make a full inquiry, blah, blah, blah. And in every difficulty, we depend upon your prudence and firmness, to Mr. J.B.'s Fisher. And as it is likely in the present situation of our public affairs that the House of Representatives should sit to do business, we instruct you to join with the intended provincial Congress to be holden at Concord. So this is to George Partridge from the town of Duxbury, October 3, 1774. The General Court is called into session on the 5th of October, 1774, up in Salem. But at the time, General Gage had initially called them to try and get the colony back on track in approving a budget and paying his salary and other things. But he realized that with the attitudes of what was happening at the time, that perhaps getting the legislative body together is not a great idea. So he sent out a notice to cancel the gathering of the state legislature. And the state legislature, all the representatives had already been chosen because you choose your state rep at town meeting. They were all in Salem already, and they said, well, you know what, we didn't get his notice. So let's just have a session. And they met in session, waited for the governor to appear. Of course, he had no intention of going. So then they said, well, the governor's not here. let's adjourn, and then let's reconvene as an independent provincial Congress. And that's the moment when the people of Massachusetts seized legislative power from the British authority. And it's one of the great moments of this revolution to talk about, because from that moment, they built a government in, ex officio, to be sure, until we send the British packing in March of 1776. But they discuss everything. They discuss taxes, standing armies. They discuss buying military supplies. They discuss slavery, education. It all happens in that first session of the Provincial Congress in Concord in the fall of 1774. And they go on to do many other wonderful things, including, by the way, so 250 years ago, this month, it was just after Lexington and Concord, they gave 10 horses, 200 pounds of gunpowder, 200 pounds of shot, 750 flints to a young man to go out and capture, a young man from Connecticut, to go out and capture Fort Ticonderoga. Anybody know who it is? Benedict Arnold. Yeah. So they give Arnold all this stuff to go out and capture. He has no men, by the way. He just has himself now 10 horses and gunpowder. But he, of course, meets up with Ethan Allen, the Green Mountain Boys, and, of course, the wonderful militia from the Berkshires to go capture Fort Ticonderoga. So before I get to that, I just want to read you a couple things from your community. So, of course, North Andover and Andover were together during this period. So I just want to share with you a couple things which I've gleaned from your town records, so you get a sense of what your town friends and neighbors were saying. So in 1765, the inhabitants of said town qualified for voting as the law directed be legally convened. And on the said day, which is the 11th of September, 1765, Captain Asa Foster was chosen moderator. Whereas sundry of the inhabitants of said town are threatened with injuries and abuses from riots, assemblies, said town unanimously voted their utter detestation and abhorrence of all such violent and extraordinary proceedings, and that the selectmen, the militia officers, and magistrates of the town be desired to use their utmost endeavor, agreeable to law, to suppress the same, and that the freeholders and other inhabitants will do everything in their power to assist them therein. So Andover, not a big fan of the rioting. They write instructions to their representative, Samuel Phillips, Esquire, representative for the town of Andover, 1765. And this is their preamble, essentially. We, the freeholders and other inhabitants of said town, legally assembled in town meeting on said day, to consider what may be proper on our part to be done at this critical conjuncture, being the time we apprehend that we and the rest of His Majesty's subjects of this province, as well as those in other provinces and colonies in British North America, are by sundry acts of Parliament of Great Britain, especially by an act commonly called the Stamp Act, in danger of being not only reduced to such indigent circumstances as will render us unable to manifest our loyalty to the Crown, as upon all other occasions we have hitherto done, by cheerfully exhibiting our substance for the defense of the British dominions. Have you all been cheerfully exhibiting your substance for the support of the Crown? That's pretty bold. And then, we skip a couple of years, and this is it. You can't just pick a year, and this gets into my next topic, which talks about independence. You can't just pick, if you really want to get a sense of the arc of the story of the American Revolution, you really do have to start reading in 1765 and follow the arc forward. Legal town meeting of the freeholder and other inhabitants of the town of Andover qualified for voting as the law directs at the North Meeting House in said town on Thursday, the 3rd day of February, 1774. The question being put, whether the town will act in answer to the letter received by the town clerk from the Committee of Correspondence mentioned in the warrant, and it is passed in the affirmative. So what was the question? They voted to choose a committee of correspondence here in Andover, and they passed a series of resolves. So these are the Andover resolves of 1774, that the disposal of their property is the inherent right of free men, that there can be no property in which another can, of right, take from us without our consent, that the claim of Parliament to tax America is, in other words, a claim of right to lay contributions on us at pleasure. Second, that the duty imposed by Parliament upon tea landed in America is a tax on Americans or levying contributions on them without their consent. Thirdly, that the express purpose for which tax is levied on the Americans, namely for the support of government, the administration of justice, and the defense of His Majesty's dominions in America, has a direct tendency to render assemblies useless and to introduce arbitrary government and slavery. Which is interesting, of course. They're making a distinction here between political slavery and actual chattel slavery. They don't see the inherent contradiction in that, which is interesting. That a virtuous and steady opposition to this ministerial plan of governing America is absolutely necessary to preserve every shadow of liberty, and is a duty from which every free man in America owes his country to himself and to his posterity. Again, they're talking about, it's not just about us. It's about our children and our grandchildren. And if we thought more like that today, we would do better. That the resolution lately come into the East India Company to send out their tea to America, subject to the payment of duties on its being landed here, is an open attempt to enforce the ministerial plan and a violent attack upon the liberties of America. That it is the duty of every American to oppose this attempt. Interesting, again, they're using the word American as a descriptor for the people who live here. They're no longer colonists, they are Americans. Seventh, resolve that no person in this town who has heretofore been concerned in vending tea or any other may on any pretense whatsoever either sell himself or be in any way accepting to the selling of any tea or foreign importation while it remains burdened with a duty under penalty of incurring the town's displeasure. And that then they sent a copy of all of those resolves to the people of Boston. And then I just wanted to jump to the end here, and let's talk about independence. So in March of 1776, the newly reestablished, well, it's at the tail end of the Second Provincial Congress, and really on the cusp of the reestablishment of the General Court, they send out instructions in March of 1776 to every town to vote whether, if the Continental Congress should call on, should decide that it was in the best interest of America to declare independence, would you support it with your life, your liberty, and your property? The phrase sacred honor is most commonly thrown in there. That shows up a little bit later. The very first town we hear from is actually the town of Hingham. They vote in April of 1776 that they will absolutely support independence. They're all over it. And then we begin to hear smatteringly from other towns. So 225 towns in 1776, we have answers from approximately 150. And so far, it is 148 to 0 to 2 abstentions. And here's Acton's town meeting response, saying we would absolutely get behind independence. Duxbury went so far as to actually write their own Declaration of Independence. It's not very long. It doesn't have Jefferson's flourish, but it's about a page, And essentially, they do it as instructions to their representative. They want him to present this to the provincial Congress. In July of 1776, when the Declaration of Independence arrives in Massachusetts, they get the copies printed in Salem. They get 500 copies printed. They send 2 copies to every town. And they ask them to, 1 copy goes to the minister. He's ordered to read it from the pulpit on several consecutive Sundays. And the town clerk is authorized or instructed to write it into the town book so that it'll be part of the people's record for all time. And some town clerks tried to make it look exactly like the broadside, to great pains to write it. So, the United States of America comes screaming across the page, and of course on the last page you have this huge John Hancock, which, by the way, is the only name that you saw on the bottom of the deck. Well, you saw 2 names. You saw 3 names. You saw 3 names on the bottom of the Declaration. You saw John Hancock, he was the president, and that's the only one that he needed. You only needed the president to sign it. You saw the secretary, Charles Thompson. He's usually attested, right? Because town clerks, they're always attesting things. Secretaries of the Continental Congress, always attesting. And then sometimes you'd see the printer. Dunlap is the most famous one. He prints the first ones in Philadelphia. Here in Massachusetts, it's printed in Salem, and I'm not going to remember who the printer was who did it. But and then so you have this is Natick, again resolving to support the idea of independence with the grand objects of peace, liberty, and safety being their end design. Some town clerks very obviously just could barely be bothered to write the whole text, right? So I can't believe they're making me write this whole thing. But it's impressive to think that across Massachusetts in town halls everywhere, you have copies of this Declaration of Independence. They did not do this with the Constitution. They did not do this with the Bill of Rights. It's only the Declaration of Independence that you find handwritten by the town clerk in your town record. And in case you're wondering, this is how it looks in Duxbury. Duxbury, seeing, this handwriting is almost 17th century. It's as if somebody, learned to write from his grandfather or something and just, but anyway, this is Duxbury's copy. And then, so let's see, meeting was adjourned to Friday, March the 8th, 1776. Here we go. At a legal town meeting of the freeholders and other qualified voters of the town of Andover at the North Meeting House on the 12th of June, 1776, the question being put whether should the Congress for the safety of the colonies declare them independent of the Kingdom of Great Britain, you will solemnly engage with your lives and fortunes to support them in the measure. It passed in the affirmative unanimously. And one of the other common features you see in some of these Committee of Correspondence records, the resolves, are the hopes that many of these communities have for the eventual outcome of the conflict. Chelsea's one of my favorite. America, like the rising sun, will shine brighter and brighter till the steady hand of time shall bring her to that happy period when she may bid defiance to every oppressor throughout the world. We might still be waiting for that happy period, but I love the sentiment. And then, but Duxbury is hoping for an ending that's quite different. They're hoping for an eventual harmony and concord, no pun intended, between Great Britain and the colonies be restored. And that is not, they are not the only people to express that sentiment, but it is definitely more uncommon than many of the other sentiments from this from this time period. That's what I have for you tonight, but I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
If anybody has any questions, please grab the mic from me and speak directly into it as I am doing, not for the benefit of everybody in the theater, but for the benefit of everybody listening and recording.
There were several words I need your help in defining. One was province. What is a province?
So a province,
Oh,
they use province because they didn't want to use the word colony. There was a period of time where they were uncertain as to where this was going to go, so they just defined a geographic area as being the province of Massachusetts.
and resolve. That was like and we resolved to do this. So it's like a new law, or
No, well, it could be construed as a law, but consider it more like a pinky swear. We resolve that this is the way we feel. We resolve that we want our representative to do this. It doesn't have the force of law necessarily, but it is meant to express the will of the community.
got it.
But not a commitment,
Right.
Exactly.
Another question: how did the loyalists fit into these town meetings?
Well, awkwardly.
Yeah.
Frequently. So it depends. I mean, so take the community of Hardwick, which is out in the western part, sort of central western Massachusetts. The big man on campus in that town was a man named Timothy Ruggles. Now, Ruggles was a huge military hero from the French and Indian Wars. And he was actually at the Stamp Act Congress in Albany, where Ben Franklin proposed the union of the colonies against British authority. Ruggles was the chairman. He was the president of that Stamp Act Congress, and he actually voted against the plan. And that's the moment where people began to sour on Ruggles. And he was eventually forced to flee. He left behind a couple of daughters who kind of managed the property, prevented it from being seized by the colony. But other towns, Plymouth is a great example because, actually I take that, yes, Plymouth. Plymouth is a perfect example. Many of the well-to-do people in town were loyalists. And many of the people like James Warren, Mercy Otis Warren, they were definitely on the Whig side, what we would call the patriot side. And they would have dueling town meetings. So they would call a town meeting, James Warren and his friends would vote one way, and then they'd go back to their farms or whatever. And the oddity of 18th century town meeting is that any 12 men can get together a petition and call for a town meeting. And due notice is supposed to be given, but it isn't always given. And so Edward Winslow, who was the local collector, great-grandson of the Edward Winslow of the Mayflower, he was a loyalist to the nth degree. His house is still there. It's now the home of the General Society of Mayflower Descendants. And that, you go into that house, it's a beautiful house on the cliff overlooking the harbor. Just the kind of house you'd expect a loyalist to live in, right? So but he would get together a town meeting, and they would, whatever James Warren and his clan just voted on, they would vote on the opposite. And that would become the rule in town. And until eventually Winslow and his faction are driven out of town, and all was right with the world.
One last question.
Of course.
How did the British, they learned about this, how did they tolerate what was
They
happening?
didn't tolerate it. That's what the Massachusetts Act is all about. It forbade town meeting. It canceled town meeting. So this is America in a nutshell, right? I love this. So he closes down the legislature. So we have no legislature in Massachusetts. He forbids town meeting. So we can't have town meetings. And the people of Massachusetts, they're like, well, how are we going to choose representatives for the provincial Congress? I know. Because everybody in Massachusetts is a lawyer, right? So they say, well, he forbade town meeting, forbade the legislature. Let's have county meetings. There's nothing in the law about county meetings. So they held a county convention. And so in 1774, there's a whole series of county conventions. You might have heard of the Suffolk Resolves. So the Suffolk Resolves are a series of resolves passed by Suffolk County. Paul Revere carries them down to the Continental Congress. They adopt them as their own. The Suffolk Resolves were not the first county resolves, nor were they the last county resolves, but they had the best messenger. And so that's the one everybody knows, but every county held a series of resolves, and in that they passed the county convention, and in that they passed a series of resolves, and they chose representatives for the provincial Congress. I love the people of Massachusetts, I really do.
Were similar events, actions throughout the colonies?
No. Only in New England do you see this.
Okay.
And so it's one of the great, other states did different things. So in Virginia, they're very much tied to corporator meetings and meetings of their legislature. Mostly other colonies don't have town meetings. It's a very New England thing. And it's one of the reasons why the British saw it as the great source of trouble. If we could only just end town meetings, would be fine. But the people of New England, we've been doing this for 150 years. So they were bound and determined to maintain that. In New York, they have, New York's a little bit different because the property owners are, like the Livingstons, the Schuyler's, they have, they're not plantations, but it's whatever the Dutch word is, I'm forgetting it at the moment, for that. They are the ones who are leading the charge for the rights of the people. But it's completely dependent upon somebody like Philip Schuyler being on the side of the Whig cause. If you have a patroon leader, say down in Brooklyn, and he's a Tory or a loyalist, then their representative in the assembly is going to be, this is one of the reasons that New York hedges on the idea of independence, because it's a very divided electorate between the property owners and let's call them the merchants and tradesmen, the mechanics is the 18th century word.
You've shown us a lot of great quotes. Where do you get all these? What's the source material for all of this?
Town meeting records and committee of correspondence letters. That's literally, I mean, eventually we're hoping that the Colonial Society of Massachusetts will publish all of these, both town meeting records from 1765 to let's be generous and call it 1780, up until the formation of the Massachusetts Constitution. That's really, it's so much more than this. I can't begin to tell you the amount of information that's in your town records, your town meeting records. The militia companies that march off on April 19th, they are paid by the town until the provincial Congress comes up with a scheme to pay or reimburse the communities for that money. They are responsible for, if you want to track people of color or underrepresented voices, this is where you're going to find these stories.
You explained to us the sort of the restrictions on who could vote in town meetings. In any given town, what percentage of the population was that group? I mean, say here in Andover at the time, if 150 people or something like that were voting, how many people actually lived in Andover?
Well, let's take Boston's probably the easiest one for me to do because I have the numbers a little bit more in my head. So the population of Boston at this time is 16,000 people. Half of those are under the age of 16. So that's 8,000 people taken away. Of the remainder, of the remaining 8,000, half of those are women. So they're not voting. So 4,000, so you're left with 4,000 potential people, and then you have to say, how many of those are people of color or transients in Boston? And let's call it 25% to be generous. So now you're left with 3,000 people who are potential voters in a community of 16,000 people. So, that's what, 20% essentially? That's probably a good average, more or less, for the towns.
So we're about 10 years into the 250th. We started in 65, right?
We did.
We have 8 or so years to go. Can you tell us more about what things are happening around here in the next few years?
Yeah, look, there's there's a couple of different competing factors here. So my vision for the 250th is not just about events that happen in Massachusetts, and I'll get into some of those in a moment, but it's really about events that happened to gain American independence in which Massachusetts people were involved. So it isn't just about Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill, et cetera. It's about Saratoga. Saratoga, 74% of all of the militia at Saratoga were from Massachusetts. 40% of the Continental Line at Saratoga were from Massachusetts. Saratoga is a great New York victory. Should we not be calling it a great Massachusetts victory? I don't say that to the people of Saratoga because I love them and they're great people. But the same is, we had more men in the field every year except 1781, the year of Yorktown. And then that doesn't count the Navy or the privateering. And I'm sure it doesn't account for a lot of the transportation. Of course, we have an armory up here in Springfield that is turning out. So we have, wagoneers and teamsters who are carrying all the stuff down. And that doesn't even begin to talk about the women and children who are working, not just keeping the farms running and the shops open, but going over and above to provide for this nascent army in the field, making coats and shoes and stockings and all the things that an army needs to continue to fight and march. So lots of great stories. So for Massachusetts, we have next month the Battle of Chelsea Creek, which is a largely unknown event. It's the first time it's been reenacted to my knowledge. And it would be strong to call this a reenactment. There'll be a small battle-ish. But essentially, the reason it's important is because it's the first time soldiers from multiple provinces, in this case Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts, worked under a unified command. And John Stark is largely involved in that, God bless him. It's the first time Massachusetts deployed field artillery in battle. It's the first time that the people of Massachusetts sank a British warship and burned it to the ground, which it had run upon. So, it wasn't going very fast when we took it out, but, so we'll be doing Chelsea Creek, we'll be doing Bunker Hill. Bunker Hill's gonna be kind of split into two parts. We'll do the commemorative events in Charlestown, where the battle actually took place and the town was destroyed. And then we'll be doing the reenactment up in Gloucester, where there's a little more room for battle scenarios and that kind of thing. There's going to be something about Arnold going to Quebec. That'll be happening up in Newburyport. There'll be events surrounding the Henry Knox Trail. Henry Knox bringing the cannon, 60 tons of cannon from Fort Ticonderoga to Massachusetts. It's almost an entirely civilian operation. Knox and his brother are the only two commissioned officers or actual soldiers in that whole expedition. So we'll be doing that in conjunction with our friends in New York. And then we are putting together a plan for what I am calling Massachusetts Independence Day, which most of you may have heard of as Evacuation Day. It's the day we drove the British out of Boston. But I'm calling it Massachusetts Independence Day because it really represents the moment where Massachusetts can, unfettered by any British authority, take control over their entire province. And the British, with one exception, which was in 1778, the British never came back to Massachusetts. And in 1778, they just committed outrages down in New Bedford, burned large portions of the town, burned 84 ships in the harbor. And then they went to Martha's Vineyard and took 10,000 sheep because they were lonely. No, I'm just and then, so that will probably, from the state of Massachusetts perspective, and by this I mean this current government of Massachusetts, they're done in 2026. I mean, Independence Day, I'm sure they will be working on something for July 4th, because we can't let Philadelphia have all the glory, but we've got World Cup coming, we've got tall ships coming in 26. So by the end of 26, we'll all be partied out. And then, but really from my perspective, the people in New Bedford are really keen to do something in 2028. We've also got the Battle of Rhode Island in 2028, which involved a lot of Massachusetts troops, including my fifth great grandfather, Lane, who was wounded at the Battle of Rhode Island. You know, as I say, I'm interested in following Massachusetts troops wherever they go. I may have to do that from another paid position, but you know, it's we'll see how all that plays out. So true. Yes, actually, exactly. So, you know, people forget that there's a whole 8 years of war that happens after the Declaration of Independence. Well, 7 years of war after the Declaration of Independence. We don't talk much about the Massachusetts men who go south. Certainly Benjamin Lincoln is a big name that we should do more with, but we'll see. Well, of course, the war really, the British government had such a hard time. Once Burgoyne surrenders in 77, they've kind of given up on the Northeast. And so they say, you know what? Down south, there's plenty of loyalists down south. Let's go down there. They'll love us. And of course, it's much more of a civil war down south. We just had a great conversation yesterday with an author who wrote a book about Francis Marion, the swamp fox. And it was brutal. I mean, there's a fight going on right now between New Jersey and South Carolina as to who had the most battles, which is amusing from, you know, it's fine. It keeps them out of trouble, let's put it that way. But it was brutal down there. It was just neighbor against neighbor, family against family. It's grim. It's a grim story. And then, of course, you know, there are New England men who play huge roles. Nathaniel Greene from Rhode Island, Benjamin Lincoln from Massachusetts. They're both generals down there. And, you know, they're essentially driving Cornwallis north and cutting off his supply lines as he moves. There's a great book called The Southern Gambit, if you're ever interested in learning about what happens in the Revolution in the South. It's brutal, no question.
I've absolutely loved your presentation and all of the slides, but I've got to say it's been punctuated by the artwork that's been associated with it, and I think like hopes and dreams are obviously depicted in this piece of art. And 2 slides back, I think it was, the backdrop looked like it might have been a political cartoon that had been out and about.
Let's see.
All right, maybe 3 slides.
Oh, is
Maybe
it this
3.
one?
No,
No?
keep going. But that was another good one. Yeah, it was, no, it was everybody talking.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, so, I know what you're saying. Under the instructions to representatives.
That's the one. Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, no, this is, so I love satire. It's just I think it's I love language, and I think satire is one of the great feats of humanity is to be able to write satirical work. And this is the perfect time period for somebody who loves that. Mercy Otis Warren, of course, is famous for her satirical plays, particularly focused on the authorities in Boston and to a lesser degree in England as well. James Gilray is the cartoonist who does a lot of these sort of political cartoons, and I love him. He's so funny, so brilliant. And you can really see, for those who may know, there was a magazine that came out in the Victorian period called Punch Magazine. And it was filled, I mean, the cartoons in that are epic as well. And you can see them, they're almost there. You can see them getting closer and closer to that sort of Punch ethos in their drawings. So, I mean, Hogarth is the same. Hogarth has a lot of great satirical, the gin lane, beer lane, talking about, he's got a series on matrimony, which are just brilliant. The sort of May, December weddings that are punctuated throughout history, even today.
Any further questions?
You were speaking about the provincial Congress meeting in the fall of 1774,
Mm-hmm.
and how that was a turning point.
Mm-hmm.
Just a couple questions. Why Concord?
Well, that's an excellent question. So they met and they established it in Salem because that's where the General Court had been ordered to meet by General Gage before he ordered them not to meet in Salem. But they met there anyway. But essentially the way it worked was they met, they adjourned, then they met as the Provincial Congress, and they adjourned to Concord. And literally that happened in an hour. And then they moved to Concord because Concord is a county town. It had a number of taverns nearby, which is always helpful when you're having discussions, right? And had a large enough population that the church, the meeting house, was going to be large enough for the Provincial Congress. And they thought it was far enough away from Boston that wasn't likely to be attacked by British soldiers or any sort of thing like that. Or so they thought.
Thank you. Just another question about the Provincial Congress.
Yep.
So members of this body, did they come from all over the state?
Every town was supposed to send at least one representative. In some cases, towns sent multiple representatives, and sometimes there was one fellow, he was from Northfield, which is out on the north end of the Connecticut River Valley, and apparently he was fairly old and infirm, and he collapsed several times during the first Provincial Congress. And essentially, one of the committees of the Provincial Congress sent this it was an amusing letter. I mean, it probably wasn't funny at the time, but I have a strange sense of humor. But they write this letter back and saying, Dear Northfield Correspondence Committee, your representative is proving too infirm to attend any of the business here at the Provincial Congress. Can you send somebody else to help him out, And so, typically speaking, it's, one town, one vote kind of situation. But sometimes there were multiple people from multiple communities. Boston, I think, sent, 12 people or something, because it's Boston, right? They always have to have their thumb on the scale. Sure. I will say, so just one other thing. Provincial Congress, definitely one of the most important moments in Massachusetts in the history of the Revolution. Second most, because we assume legislative and executive authority through the Provincial Congress. Number two is the moment that the men in Concord marched offensively to Concord Bridge and not defensively. And that is the moment that we crossed the Rubicon, as it were.
Any other questions this evening? Well, if not,
Okay,
one more round
thank
of
you.
applause, please. And thank you again for everyone coming.